We think of theme parks as perfect worlds of fun and smiles, but beneath all that fake joy, some rides hide a truly terrifying past, and today, we're looking at the absolute worst of them. Stay tuned. From an inflatable castle that flew into the air carrying people inside to a carnival worker who was struck by a rotating steel arm during an overnight teardown, ending in the most horrifying way possible. It was May 17th, 2017, on an open sports field on the outskirts of Nakhon Ratchasima, Thailand, where a pop-up theme park is in full swing. The conditions for a disaster have been aligning all afternoon, and the victims are already in line. Taran Ponsak was 18 years old and spent most of his free time playing soccer games on whatever patch of ground was available. His cousin, Mek Niran, was 17 and preferred arcade machines and controlled environments. I can picture them perfectly, the active one dragging the cautious one along, and I just know that dynamic is about to break my heart. The inflatable castle, a towering, commercial-grade inflatable attraction the size of a small house, anchored by stakes and filled with blower-fed air, stood at the edge of the midway. You'd think something that huge and heavy would be secure, right? I would have assumed the same thing. Now, Mek had not wanted to go on the inflatable. Taran had insisted the way older cousins do when they've already decided for everyone, and Mek had followed because that was also how it went between them. They paid, they waited in line, and they walked through an entrance that was still open. The staff had not stopped admissions. The line behind them was growing. Nothing about the way the inflatable was being operated that afternoon communicated that anything was wrong. But the thing is, I don't buy that for a second. Operators always know when something's off. They just choose to ignore it. What the operators running that structure had failed to address was this. Several anchor stakes had never been reinstalled after the inflatable was relocated earlier that week. While others had been driven too shallow into the ground, people standing near the perimeter had already noted the structure rocking and shifting sideways in the wind. None of those observations became a decision to close the line. The wind that caught the base of the inflatable at approximately 3:20 p.m. was not a freak event. It was the same wind that had been building for an hour across an open field with no windbreak. A vendor selling grilled corn roughly 40 feet away said later that he had been watching the inflatable shift for several minutes before it happened. The way you watch something and think it probably won't, and then it does. The structure lifted on the side nearest the midway first. Witnesses described a low, heavy sound, less like a snap and more like a held breath, releasing as the remaining anchor points gave way. The inflatable rose at an angle, climbing to approximately 33 feet, rotating as it went. People near the entrance began screaming before it reached its apex. Several started running toward it before they had anything to run toward. Riders were visible tumbling inside the structure as it inverted. Taran cleared the opening first. Witnesses close enough described him landing head first on packed dirt beside the midway, his body going fully still on contact. He did not move again. Mek was ejected seconds later onto a grassy section roughly 15 feet away, rolling twice before stopping. He was conscious. He was also unable to get up. Ambulances arrived in approximately 11 minutes. Taran was transported unresponsive, pulseless, and not breathing, and was pronounced dead at a regional medical facility. The coroner identified the cause of death as a fatal cervical spine fracture with catastrophic spinal cord injury sustained on impact with the packed ground. Inspectors who reviewed the site afterward documented multiple absent anchor points and no formal wind speed monitoring protocol in place for that structure. Mek spent several weeks in hospital with 3 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, and a lung contusion. He recovered physically, but I know he'll carry that mental scar forever, and I hope he knows none of this was his fault. Taran trusted that the operators running it had done their jobs. The next story is about what happens when that same trust gets extended to someone who had no business being trusted with. It was October 26th, 2016, on the outskirts of Nagpur, India, where a seasonal theme park had been erected over a weekend on a vacant lot. It's one of those places that exist for 1 week and then disappear without a trace, leaving nothing behind except what they took. Sarita Bendre was 68 years old and had spent 31 years as a librarian at a government elementary school in Nagpur's Eastern Ward before retiring. She was not someone who sought spectacle. She had come that night because her 2 grandchildren, ages 7 and 9:10 had asked her to bring them. She spent most of the evening near the food stalls, seated on a folding chair she had brought from a vendor's arrangement, watching the children move between attractions while she held a paper cup of chai with both hands. My heart breaks for her she wasn't chasing thrills, just spending her last days with her grandkids. The pendulum ride had been assembled that afternoon on uneven, softened ground despite workers' warning that the rear support column was unstable. The site supervisor ignored the concern to keep the ride on schedule, and after about 40 minutes of operation, witnesses noticed the rear base plate shifting slightly with each swing, though most assumed it was normal movement.
Call me detached, but I don't care about schedules. You hear a warning about stability, you stop. Full stop.
Her grandchildren had wandered toward another attraction only minutes earlier while Sarita remained behind. She was still holding her paper cup of chai when a single loud metallic crack cut through the music. People turned toward the pendulum ride just as the rear support column gave way at the shifting base plate. The entire ride, arm torqued sideways under its own momentum, and the gondola continued swinging as the structure began collapsing around it. As the frame twisted apart, sections of the secondary support assembly started breaking away. Witnesses described riders being thrown from the gondola in groups, some after restraint failures, others as the structure came apart. They landed across the crowd perimeter in a radius investigators later measured at up to 60 feet. People in the landing zone had no time to move. A section of the gondola's lateral support arm, later estimated at roughly 40 pounds of steel framing, was thrown into the seated area near the food stalls. It struck Sarita across the chest while she was still in her chair. She did not stand. She did not move after impact. Bystanders who reached her within seconds described her as already unresponsive. Her body partially collapsed forward, her cup still on the ground beside her.
I'm not going to describe what they saw in more detail than that. Sometimes things don't need to be pressed further.
The official post-mortem later determined Sarita's cause of death to be traumatic cardiac and pulmonary injury resulting from blunt force impact to the chest. Investigators later confirmed that the ride had been assembled by a 20-year-old temporary laborer with no formal certification or training in ride installation. Police filed negligence charges against the ride operator, the site supervisor, and the fair organizer, while local authorities suspended the remaining attractions. Her two grandchildren were not physically injured, but they lost the grandmother who had brought them there that evening. The gap between the warning and the outcome here was not technical, it was administrative. Someone was told the ground wasn't right and chose the schedule anyway, and a 68-year-old woman who came to watch her grandchildren enjoy their evening paid for it with her life. The next story is the same failure, where another woman said yes to a night out she'd never get back. It was April 13th, 2019, in a shopping mall parking lot in Laguna, Philippines, where a temporary carnival had taken over roughly 200 feet of paved asphalt and strung lights between steel frames that shifted just enough in the evening wind to make the whole setup feel slightly less fixed than it appeared. Leanne May Ortega was 34 years old and worked as a cashier at a mid-sized supermarket chain in her municipality, a position she had held for 6 years. She raised her 12-year-old son, Enzo, without a partner, and she built most of her rare days off around whatever he had been asking for longest. She had put this particular trip off for weeks before finally agreeing to go. The yo-yo ride, a swing carousel that lifts riders outward on long chains as the platform spins, was one of 3 main attractions operating that evening. By 7 p.m., the line had grown to roughly 20 people. Operators were cycling through quickly. The crowd was building and the queue was not thinning, they were rushing. And we all know rushing and heavy machinery are a match made in hell. Between each cycle, a restraint check was performed, one operator moving down the row of occupied seats, checking each seat belt and pressing each restraint bar in sequence before moving to the next rider.
I think about what a restraint inspection looks like when someone is working fast with a long line behind them. It probably looks almost identical to a careful one.
At least 2 bystanders later told investigators that Leanne had mentioned her seatbelt and restraint bar feeling slightly loose before the ride was dispatched. Whether the operator heard her clearly or whether she was acknowledged and waved past was never definitively resolved. What is documented is that the ride was cleared and the cycle began. The yo-yo reached full operational speed within approximately 40 seconds. At peak rotation, riders are lifted to roughly 25 to 30 feet above the asphalt surface, suspended outward on chains at a sharp angle. Enzo and several other parents were watching from a roped boundary line approximately 30 feet away.
Imagine being that kid watching your mom fly through the air thinking it's fun until it's not.
What followed did not happen all at once. During one of the outward rotations at full extension, Leanne's body shifted in the seat. Witnesses along the boundary rope noticed something was wrong before anyone fully understood what they were seeing. She was sitting unevenly compared to the other riders, her body gradually slipping farther out of the restraint with each pass. Moments later, Leanne slipped completely out of the improperly secured restraint system and fell headfirst from approximately 25 to 30 feet onto the exposed pavement below. The ride continued rotating for several additional seconds before the operator cut power, then coasted briefly before coming to a complete stop. Screams erupted from the crowd as people rushed toward where she had landed. Her breathing was shallow and audible to the people who reached her within the first minute. A security guard arrived almost immediately and radioed for medical assistance, while a bystander near Enzo pulled the boy back and kept him facing away. Mall security simultaneously called emergency services, and an ambulance transported her to a hospital. The attending physician's summary described her injuries as severe blunt force trauma to the skull and cervical spine. She was admitted to a regional hospital and remained in intensive care for 2 weeks before being declared brain dead. Enzo went to live with his maternal grandparents. The carnival operator faced civil liability proceedings, and the ride was impounded pending formal safety inspection. Authorities also opened an investigation into possible negligence and reviewed the ride's operating permits and inspection records. I think a ride that kills someone in front of 20 waiting families deserves more than an impound notice, but unfortunately, that is not typically how these cases move. And if Leanne's restraint failed in seconds, and everyone around her could see exactly what went wrong, the next one took years to build toward. It was July 21st, 2014, on the outskirts of Perm, Russia, where a traveling carnival had occupied a flat stretch of fairground. By 7 o'clock, the grounds were loud with generators, music, and the particular noise a crowd makes when it has collectively decided the night is going well. Nobody present would describe it that way afterward. Maxim Yerov was 29 years old and worked as a forklift mechanic at a regional warehouse distribution facility east of the city, a position he had held for 6 years. He arrived that evening with 4 colleagues after completing a weekend shift, still wearing his work boots. While waiting in line for the coaster, he mentioned to the person beside him that the ride reminded him of one from his childhood. That detail appeared later in witness statements, and I find it quietly devastating the way ordinary nostalgia can walk a person directly into something irreversible. The coaster had been purchased from a shuttered amusement park the previous year, cosmetically restored with fresh paint, and returned to service following structural repairs conducted by carnival maintenance personnel. Field welds had been applied to load-bearing frame joints at multiple points along the track, without documented engineering approval or certified inspection. None of this was documented in any way a structural review would find adequate, and no records showed an independent structural inspection after the undocumented repairs before the ride reopened that season. In the hour before Maxim's group boarded, several passengers reported hearing sharp, rhythmic banging during one specific curve. One described it as metal contacting metal rather than normal wheel noise. 2 of those passengers reported it to a staff member at the exit ramp. The operator told them it was normal, and the ride continued loading. Like everyone else waiting in line, Maxim had no reason to believe anything was wrong. He boarded the 3rd car with his co-workers when it was their turn. As the train entered the curved descent near the 2nd support pylon, a single dense crack echoed across the fairground. Within seconds, the 3rd car left the track. It rotated outward along the curve and slammed sideways into a lateral steel support column. The front section folded inward on impact, trapping Maxim inside the crushed framework before the ride finally came to a stop. Maxim was pinned between the collapsed seat assembly and the twisted forward framework of the car when first responders reached him, suffering severe crush injuries to his chest and abdomen. A station employee placed the emergency call within seconds of the impact. First responders arrived in approximately 10 minutes, but extracting him required hydraulic cutting equipment and took approximately 40 minutes.
I can't even imagine the helplessness of those responders knowing they were racing a clock that had already run out.
He was pronounced dead immediately upon removal from the wreckage. After investigators completed their on-site documentation, the remaining carnival attractions resumed relocation over the following days, while the coaster remained under official control for examination. Meanwhile, as the carnival continued, Maxim was buried in a city cemetery several days after the incident. Can you imagine if you were one of the co-workers with him? Imagine what it means to carry that home from a shift that was already supposed to be finished. Maxim's death came down to metal that had been patched together, a failure hidden inside the machine. The next one wasn't hidden at all. It was January 5th, 2018, at a theme park ground on Vijayawada, India. The wheel at the center of the grounds had been turning for 3 hours by the time the soil beneath it ran out of patience. Rishi Malik was 17 years old and sat 2 rows ahead of Anya Patel in their secondary school classroom. He had told his mother he wanted to study civil engineering. Anya Patel was 16, the younger of 2 siblings, and had finished her final term papers 2 days prior. A group of 6 friends had decided on the carnival together, the kind of plan made quickly and without much weight, a reward at the end of something difficult. It's frustrating how a normal afternoon can erase years of plans in just a few moments. The Ferris wheel had been assembled on uneven, poorly compacted ground with one support leveled using timber cribbing instead of a proper engineered foundation. By the time Rishi and Anya boarded, the ride had already completed several normal rotations.
Having covered multiple theme park incidents, if I'm getting on that ride, I'd assume somebody already made sure the basics were done right.
3 of their friends were waiting at the base when the rotation began. One of them, a 15-year-old boy who gave a statement to investigators the following day, said he noticed a slow lean in the wheel's frame after its 3rd full rotation. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing you might attribute to perspective or the movement of lights overhead. He looked at the operator. The operator was already loading the next gondola.
Not gonna lie, I probably would have convinced myself I was imagining it too. And that's what makes this so unsettling.
The eastern support leg had been sinking incrementally into the poorly compacted earth since the wheel began running. Witnesses in line described a low grinding sound, not loud, closer to the sound a wooden floor makes under concentrated weight before anything visual confirmed what was happening. Then the leg dropped, and the wheel began tilting at an angle that removed any remaining ambiguity. At the highest point of the wheel, approximately 48 feet from the ground, the gondola, carrying Rishi and Anya, rotated violently as the frame shifted. The distortion of the gondola frame caused the door latch assembly to disengage. Witnesses on the ground described both teenagers gripping the gondola frame visible, clear, and brief. Their descent took under 2 seconds. They struck the compacted dirt at the base of the wheel's arc before the structure came to rest at roughly a 40-degree angle.
I can't imagine watching something like that, knowing there was absolutely nothing anyone below could do.
Carnival staff contacted emergency services within minutes of the collapse. Several adults in the crowd initiated first aid while bystanders cleared the area. Ambulances arrived approximately 13 minutes after the call was placed. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. The attending medical team's findings described the cause of death for both as massive blunt force head trauma with multiple skeletal fractures. An engineering assessment completed in the weeks following concluded that the ground beneath one support leg had failed under the load. But that finding changed nothing for the 2 families who buried their children that week in ceremonies held 1 day apart in the same city where Rishi and Anya had been sitting in the same classroom 3 days before. Now, contrary to the previous stories, our last incident started after the lights went off when the carnival stops being a place of joy and becomes a job. It was November 2nd, 2020, on the riverfront grounds of a theme park in Suzhou, China, at approximately 2:40 in the morning, when a series of small, unremarkable decisions converged into something that could not be walked back. Yang Zhongyang was 38 years old and had worked seasonal fair transport and teardown jobs for the better part of a decade. His role was equipment, transport, guiding trailers, managing load positioning, filling wherever a shift ran short. Coworkers described him as reliable and quiet, someone who took overnight teardown shifts without being asked because the pay differential mattered. He had no disciplinary record and no history of violating site protocols. That detail is worth holding on to. The carnival had been operating along the riverside for 11 days before its licensed run ended. By midnight, the midway was empty of visitors and the dismantling process was already behind schedule. Transport trucks needed to be cleared before dawn to avoid municipal traffic restrictions. Get this, supervisors had compressed what was typically a 6-hour teardown into something closer to 4.
I don't care how experienced a crew is. Rushing teardown work around heavy machinery is asking for mistakes and lawsuits.
Yang was assigned to assist a coworker reversing a flatbed trailer into position near the swing ride section. The ride had been partially disassembled, but its central rotating arm had not yet been secured in a fixed position. Under normal protocol, a verbal clearance confirmation between the crane operator and ground crew was required before the arm was repositioned. That confirmation did not happen. Investigators later determined that a communication breakdown during hand signaling led the crane operator to initiate a rotation while Yang was within its swing radius.
For me, skip communication is never a small mistake when steel is moving.
There is no indication from the footage that Young was aware the arm was moving. He was looking back toward the trailer, his body angled away from the machinery, positioned approximately roughly 4 feet inside the marked exclusion zone while gesturing to the reversing driver. The outer end of the arm swept through a radius of roughly 30 feet. At the speed it was traveling, the window between initial movement and point of contact was approximately roughly 8 seconds.
Can you imagine having only 8 seconds and not even realizing you're in danger? That's terrifying to me.
No worker in the immediate area directly witnessed the impact. 3 crew members had their backs turned. The crane operator's sightline was obstructed by the ride's central housing. What multiple workers later told investigators they heard was a sound they initially took for equipment contacting pavement, a single, flat, heavy sound, without echo. The steel arm struck Young on the left side of the head at the outer arc of its swing. The force threw him approximately 9 feet onto the concrete. He did not move after landing. The machinery completed the intended repositioning movement before coming to a stop. A crew member sweeping nearby turned toward the sound roughly 40 seconds later and found him face down and motionless on the ground. The site supervisor called emergency services within 2 minutes of workers reaching him. Paramedics arrived in approximately 12 minutes and confirmed death at the scene. The coroner's findings described the cause of death as catastrophic blunt force cranial trauma resulting in immediate fatal brain injury. Poverty doesn't force people into dangerous work so much as it removes every other option first. Young took overnight teardown shifts because they paid slightly more, and that specific calculation placed him on that specific piece of ground at 2:40 in the morning. Investigators reconstructed the full sequence almost entirely from security camera footage, as no worker had directly observed the impact itself. The carnival operator revised its teardown communication protocols in the weeks following.
What we're left with, past the procedural revisions and the filed reports, is the image of a man doing exactly what he was supposed to do, in the wrong place by 8 seconds.